start talking as I walk up. It's really great to be here and see so many old friends back in my old stomping ground here. So, and I just want to say that Suzanne's presentation was a great kind of warm-up for what I'm going to be doing today in several ways. One is to show me how little time I have to give my remarks, so I'm going to try to go through quickly, but also just to start with this kind of idea of this kind of false dichotomy between these big industrial sectors, agriculture, services, and manufacturing. We have developed a survey here and a kind of a data model for kind of measuring economic activity that really doesn't differentiate between manufacturing and services. It's a kind of a generic model, if you will. So I think that one of the things that we've noticed today is that is a continuous use of kind of stylized facts that are really necessary to use because we don't have good information. There's a lot of excellent research going on using kind of microdata linking, using business registers to kind of enrich the data, and the work of people like Susan Hausman of kind of drilling down into some of the assumptions. But I think in the end, we're going to have to develop direct measures of the phenomenon that we're interested in order to answer some of these questions. And it's a long road, but there's a lot of people on it right now, colleagues around the world that are really developing kind of new data models. And Claire and I have been working on this project for about 3 or 4 years. And it really is to address some of these gaps that we've been talking about. The data gaps, questions, there's just a few, but is domestic outsourcing kind of linked to global outsourcing? What about, we have almost no data on kind of outsourcing to independent suppliers. We have some data in this country, but hardly anywhere else, about outsourcing to affiliates. But this idea of global value chains, of modularity that Suzanne was talking about, is the idea that you can kind of link to suppliers around the world in a much more easy way, and that this has grown so quickly. So we have really no way of measuring these things. So we have to take the hard step of developing new measures. Because we have policy gaps that come out of this lack of data. And we've talked about, this is kind of what we're talking about today. And I really don't think we can get good answers until we get better data. So what you're seeing, I'm going to present today is a project. It's really kind of a new approach here in the U.S. So you're seeing the kind of chick kind of cracking out of the egg, right? So it's very preliminary. We have a very small a sample, but I think we have some interesting results. So we start with the idea that globalization is really it comes out of firm strategy. And if you break it down, this is the very well-known 4x4, that there's 4 choices that companies can make. I mean, in line with what Suzanne was talking about de-verticalization and the breakup of the vertically integrated firm, which was all in the upper left-hand box. But the choices today are domestic outsourcing, or setting up an international affiliate, or international sourcing to an independent supplier. So we kind of use this as a basis for our data model. And then we ask for each of these 4 quadrants about outsourcing and offshoring in this case, but it could be lots of other things. And we do ask about other items along this list. This is a kind of Michael Porter-ish kind of list of business functions. So the value chain really rotating around this kind of primary business function, which would be the kind of NAICS code of the organization or company, with a kind of generic list of other activities that all firms have to either do or outsource. I mean, there are firms that don't rely on R&D in any way, but most of these other functions, companies have to do it or source it. So this is an attempt at generating a generic list of mutually exclusive and exhaustive functions. So it's a very kind of compact, parsimonious classification scheme, if you will, that is equally, well, I'll talk a little bit about the benefits here. It's generic, So it's equally applicable to service producing. That NAICS code could be a service or a good. It's applicable to both international and domestic sourcing. And then this is something that's very important for the research that we're doing that's intuitive. That managers can answer questions about this short list of functions because that's how they think about their organizations. You're not giving them a list of 500 occupational codes and asking them to go down the list and answer questions. You're asking them about their business functions, and we've had a lot of success in getting seemingly good answers from managers on that list. And, you know, we're kind of doing this in the context of a lot of work that's been done about services offshoring, where people were counting jobs that were, including some of our esteemed colleagues of Cynthia Kroll and Ashok Bardhan here, looking at jobs that were vulnerable to services offshoring. But one problem with that is that it's relatively rare for companies to trade tasks. We hear a lot in international organizations today about trade and tasks, or that jobs move. But in fact, you know, there's the field research that we've done shows that companies tend to kind of bundle up a group or a division and kind of outsource that or source that externally. So we feel like these business functions are kind of the kind of group of bundle of tasks that are that can be outsourced. I mean, as Suzanne was saying, that kind of codified link, or if you can exchange information on the inside, I mean, going into and out of those functions, those bundle of tasks, those kind of tacit jobs, those tacit interactions inside the bundle can just go with that group, right? So anyway, because people are looking at different types of jobs, whether they have tacit or codified activities inside of them. So anyway, there's other activities going around the world in the European Union and Canada. So I'm probably pretty much out of time, but I'll keep going. So anyway, we went in and asked about sourcing costs. Okay, so we asked what percentage of your costs were in each of these 4 quadrants. Remember the box here. We asked them about 3 types of locations, where they were sourcing, if they were sourcing internationally, if it was in developing countries with costs much lower than the US, emerging companies with somewhat lower, or industrialized countries with costs the same or higher than the US. We also asked them what percent of their sales were international. We have a very small sample, so we have a very kind of rough industry breakdown, but we do have a goods producing sector that'll show you some results from that. We asked about wages and benefits, percentage part-time, full-time, and then we asked about the distribution of how many people you had working for you inside your company in the US along those 8 business functions. And then we asked in each function what the wage rates were. And then we asked about questions about retirement and insurance benefits in general. I mean, surprisingly, people were able to give us numbers about how many people they had working in each function, and also wage ranges within each function, percent of people working within these wage ranges. Pretty remarkable, really, to us how well this worked. So I won't go into too much details about this sample, but we have a sample that's representative of employment, and then we have a large firm sample, because we wanted to measure global engagement, right? And we knew ahead of time that the average place where people worked, which is, you know, the nursing home or the city government, wasn't going to be globally engaged, so we needed to add a set of large firms. So we went into the Fortune 1000 and pulled out business segments. I can talk more about that. So we used the business function framework. We looked at business segments inside the Fortune 1000 as a unit of analysis, and then we quantified the sourcing practices, which they don't do in Europe and Canada. They just said, do you source this function or not? We asked them what percent of the costs were there. And then in the end, we're going to have a public use data set. So what we want all you smart people to do is download our data and do some work that's better than what we're doing with it. So just to show you what we found, well, first of all, very small. In the end of the day, 334 organizations completed the survey. 129 small, less than 500, 205 large. So here's how, this is a kind of first map of kind of organizations in this sample anyway, according to business function. So about 2/3 of employment kind of across the board is in this primary business function. So that might be manufacturing for a goods producing company, or it might be providing call center services in a call center company, et cetera. Surprisingly, about half of the organizations in our sample had at least one person in R&D. And we define that very broadly. So it's like R&D, development, and everything else. So, and then if you look at the kind of average distribution of employment, so in our sample, R&D, again, broadly defined, is about 3% of employment. So what about globalization? Let's get down to the fun stuff. So in our entire sample, there's this kind of light blue line at the bottom. That's in-house domestic. Okay, so everything else up on top is the dark blue is domestically outsourced, and then those two little thin lines in the top that I've circled in red are international sourcing. So international sourcing is quite rare on average. Particularly for small firms. I mean, again, the dark blue is this is just to 20, instead of 100%, it's to 25. We've taken out the in-house piece, so we can accentuate the outsourcing and offshoring. And for small companies, transportation, information technology, and facilities maintenance are commonly outsourced domestically, but very, very little international sourcing for small companies. Of course, we didn't talk systematically. We wanted to startups. We did that part of that sample didn't get funded, unfortunately. But for large organizations, it's a really different picture. Large organizations are much more globally engaged across a range of business functions than small organizations. So when I tell you something surprising, raise your hand. Nobody's raising their hand. And this is kind of what we already knew, but we're getting some data back on it. Or what we assumed was true, we're getting some results back on it to show that our intuition was correct. And here, very important for this conference, if you look at the lower left-hand pie chart, almost all of the, a huge portion of the international sourcing is in goods-producing industries, and after that, trade, really, out of the services and trade category that we combined. So here's another kind of a depiction of that same fact. You see in the public and health and education sectors, almost no international sourcing, but in goods producing and trade and services sectors, a pretty wide distribution of international sourcing across business functions. R&D, again, concentrated in goods producing, international sourcing of R&D concentrated in goods producing firms. Now, what kind of location did these companies, when they did do international sourcing, where did they go? Well, mainly they went to high-cost areas, high-cost countries. So Europe, Japan, and the top line is very, very low cost. The kind of middle-range companies, countries really didn't get much international sourcing. But my interpretation of this is that you have a kind of legacy in large companies of deep kind of engagement between Europe and the U.S. So this is a snapshot. What we want to do is kind of extend this over time to get a time series where we can see perhaps this kind of these red areas of the chart growing over time. So analytic findings. There's a few questions we've asked the data so far. This is very preliminary. If an organization outsources its primary business function, that kind of NAICS code function, the main thing they do, domestically, that's not bad. Is it more likely to outsource that, to source that internationally? And here we have combined, unfortunately, there were so few companies that indicated that they were sourcing internationally from independent suppliers as opposed to their affiliates, that we just kind of lumped those together. So we have international sourcing, which is affiliates mostly, and a little bit of international, these independent suppliers. So if the organization outsources its primary business function domestically, is it more likely to do that internationally? Is there kind of a contagion effect? Well, no. So this is a very kind of weak result. Next question. If an organization outsources its primary business function internationally, is it more likely to to outsource the support functions, the rest of it. Now, the answer was pretty strongly yes across all functions. So if a company is kind of globally engaged, it tends to kind of, it's more likely that the other functions will go with it. So that's a very strong result. So the next question, do organizations internationally source a higher share of their primary business function when they locate it in locations with lower costs, with very low costs? And the answer was yes. And this is a result that's almost entirely driven by the goods producing sector. So, well, that's kind of self-explanatory. Anyway, if an organization sources its primary business function internationally, we'll have lower, now this getting into the employment questions, we'll have lower levels of employment in the primary business function at home. So, in other words, are you substituting for in-house employment by outsourcing? Yes. So employment tends to be lower for companies in the primary business function for companies that are internationally sourcing. Now this is a result that's is significant in the full sample, not significant only because we have so few cases in the goods producing sample, but the trend is in the same direction. So we feel pretty confident about that. So what about earnings? What about effects on wages of international sourcing? So do domestic earnings vary at all with what's located abroad? So we saw some effects in certain functions. So it depends on the function. In the primary business function, what we saw was jobs paying over $90,000 a year there tended to be more of those jobs. That's a typo. When they sourced the primary business function internationally. And it was the same with customer service. So those two functions. But here is jobs, the trend line, both in goods producing organizations and the full sample for jobs over 90,000 tended to be higher. Okay, so if you outsource your primary function, say it's manufacturing, the folks who are left earn more. And then on the opposite side, the folks who are earning $40,000 or less, there tend to be fewer of them. Okay, so it's exactly what we'd expect. Data quality, just very quickly, what did people, because this is really mostly a proof, not mostly, this is a big part of it for me, this is a proof of concept on the business function framework for collecting economic data. Only 5.5% of respondents said they didn't know when we asked them about their business functions. And then we had some folks who put 0 in their primary business function, which suggested they didn't really understand what you're talking about. About 7% of respondents did that. But in general, we were very happy, and the results looked pretty strong at the end of the day. So what have we learned from this study? Outsourcing and offshoring both are pretty rare on average. They're concentrated, these practices are concentrated in the goods producing sector and trade. Domestic outsourcing is concentrated in transport, IT services, and facilities maintenance. Nothing really surprising there. Trucking, janitorial services, and IT, which was outsourced in the 80s. I mean, it's kind of the first thing in a way that went. International sourcing is spread across all functions, including R&D, and it's mainly carried out by large firms through their affiliates. And mostly to high-cost locations. So, and then in terms of our analytic findings, international sourcing may reduce employment at home, especially low-wage employment. So nobody's raised their hand when nobody's surprised, okay. But I think that these kind of data projects, if you do a decent job, you do a lot of work to show people what they already know, which is why I've tried to avoid these types of projects. But I think that these results are kind of strongly intuitive, and in many ways, it's the first time we've seen direct answers to some of the questions that we were asking today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I want to
Thank the, oh, you want the pen or this? No?
That's a pointer.
Pointer, okay. That shows my technological, okay. So this is going to be a little bit different. I came naked, no PowerPoint, so I'm just going to talk to you. Also, I'm going to shift the focus more directly to policy. I'm really kind of elaborating a bit of a policy proposal to deal with advanced manufacturing. I have 3 co-authors. Since there's no PowerPoint, I should mention their names: Matt Keller, Josh Whitford, and Andrew Schrenk. I guess I want to start where Suzanne kind of started with Colin Clark, but my version wasn't Colin Clark, it was Daniel Bell. And the idea is that there was an agricultural era, there was an industrial era, and that we've entered a post-industrial era. This is an argument I've been working on since the 1970s when I was 12. And but that I think that people often misunderstand the post-industrial argument, because when there was a transition from the agricultural to the industrial era, agriculture didn't disappear. People would have starved. Agriculture was transformed in the industrial era. It took a different form. And so the argument about a post-industrial era is that manufacturing doesn't disappear. It remains important, but it's transformed. As Suzanne said, manufacturing outputs are bundled with services, and the nature of the organization of manufacturing firms changes. So I'm arguing here in favor of public sector policies to support advanced manufacturing in the US, kind of within this post-industrial problematic. And essentially, coming back to the earlier discussions, my arguments for doing that are partly international trade arguments, but primarily this co-location argument, that the innovation process, R&D, and manufacturing, it seems to me that in many, many sectors, there are synergies that require or that encourage co-location, and that the Apple model of having the production go on the other side of the world is problematic. So I've got essentially 3 premises of this argument that I'm making. And the first premise, my previous research in the book that was referenced, but the title wasn't given, was called State of Innovation, and it's an edited collection which documents the U.S. government's role in technology development in the U.S. And contrary to some of the earlier discussions about, oh, the U.S. shouldn't have industrial policy and we shouldn't pick winners and losers, I've got news for you. The U.S. has a very sophisticated, has elaborated over the decades, a very sophisticated system for moving technologies from the laboratory space to the commercial space. That one of the particular empirical pieces that we did was that we studied the R&D 100 magazine recognizes each year 100 innovations that incorporate cool new technologies. And we did an analysis of these. In 2006, there were 88 domestic award winners of this competition, and we were able to show the federal dollars going to the research group that got the award at the particular firm or collaboration among firms in 77 of those 88 cases. In other words, the federal government, through a highly decentralized program that operates through alphabet soup of different types of programs, is involved in innovation across the civilian economy. Now, the problem with this system historically, up to the Obama administration, as other people have said, is that the characteristic is that we would develop through these public-private partnerships things like flat panel displays, solar panels, be ahead of the rest of the world, but that our reluctance was to there was resistance to government policies to move to mass production, and what we saw in case after case was that production of those things moved offshore because governments in other countries were able to help firms with that process. So my argument is that this innovation system, it's not perfect. It's very clearly not simply the free market, that the government role in it is quite substantial, and that Suzanne pointed to one of the weaknesses in this innovation system, which is that our financial institutions, our financial structure, is oriented towards putting huge amounts of money into collateralized debt obligations and other kinds of shaky pieces of paper, and firms in these high-tech sectors, that these small startup firms continue to be starved for capital, that we don't have an adequate financial infrastructure for that. Okay, the second premise is, and Suzanne also talked about this in the breakdown of vertical integration. I'm actually not as nostalgic as she is for these big vertically integrated corporation. I'm a fan of this more decentralized forms of production based on smaller firms. So I would emphasize that what we've been moving towards is networked forms of both innovation and production. We find with those R&D 100 awards that they're increasingly going to collaborations between public and private firms, multiple private firms, that there are a lot of parties involved, but that the production process itself, again, the auto industry is very clear. We know now that they've adopted the Japanese model, that they're subcontractors, subcontractors. Much less of the value added is done in-house at the big firms. They're working in collaboration with many of these supplier firms. Now, the issue is that, and here I'm drawing on an argument that Josh Whitford and Andrew Schrank have made in a series of articles, is that we talk about market failure, we talk about state failure, but we need to talk about network failure. When we move from vertical integration to networked systems, we have to recognize that networks fail, and they fail, and this goes to Suzanne's point about the ecosystem, they fail because innovators can't find the network partners that they need. They can't find partners at all. They find partners who don't have the competence that they need to have. They find partners who have the competence but rip them off, that steal their IP or do something other bad to them, network partners who are untrustworthy. And so what Whitford and Schrank emphasize is that this decentralized system of government innovation programs, part of its success is that those government programs don't just provide capital and other resources to startup firms and to others. They also help to overcome these network failures. And they do this in a variety of ways. One is to connect that the government program officers, scientists, engineers on the public payroll help connect the firms with partners. They also essentially validate and can raise the skill level of partners through a variety of different mechanisms. And then lastly, the government programs often essentially provide a kind of Lester and Peori talk about collaborative public space, that they can essentially discourage opportunism by network partners. They create a framework in which there's higher trust, that the different business groups are able to cooperate and not fight over who owns the intellectual property. So okay, that my third premise here is that, and this is kind of going back historically, is that as the industrial era began as I was saying before, and the nature of agriculture changed, that farming became more science-based, more based on the quality of the inputs that farmers were using, the seed, the pesticide, the fertilizers, and so forth. The institutional innovation that we developed in the US was agricultural extension. And again, it wasn't just the agricultural extension agents, they were backed up by a system which included laboratories at the Department of Agriculture, laboratories at the land-grant institutions, which were able to develop bodies of knowledge which allowed extension agents to provide very specific information to farmers in a particular locality, raising a particular crop, facing a particular pest, whatever, how to structure their farming to handle that. So in other words, the industrial era gave us agricultural extension. It follows that, it was referenced earlier, that what we need in a post-industrial era for advanced manufacturing is manufacturing extension. We have a program, it was referenced earlier, the Manufacturing Extension Partnership. It began in 1989. When did I start? But the point here is that MEP, as it's called, has been a very successful program. Early on in its lifetime, there was an effort by conservatives to eliminate the program because it was seen as government interference, and essentially the small manufacturing firms that had been helped. And again, the program provides a wide range of forms of technical assistance that essentially are designed to help small manufacturing firms. And what we have to remember here is that in the US, there are still today 262,000 or so small manufacturing firms, some of them very, very small, some of them more substantial. But we also know that across the manufacturing sector, there are huge variations in productivity, and some of those small manufacturing firms, might as well be in the 19th century in terms of their the technologies that they use. So the argument is that a program like manufacturing extension could play an extremely important role in upgrading the quality of those manufacturing skills. And by building that program, and so just to give you the information, the program is funded now at the level of about $142 million a year. I think that was the president's budget request for 2012. It probably came out as even less than that after it went through the congressional mull. So the program currently is able to fund about 1,400 field staff. So think of the math, it's 1,400 field staff dealing with 262,000 firms, that obviously it's an enormous mismatch. So the policy proposal that my colleagues and I are making is that we should think of expanding the scale of this very dramatically so that something on the scale of $5 billion a year to fund not only a dramatic expansion of the number of these localized manufacturing extension partnership offices, expand the size of the offices, but also build the linkages that we had in the agricultural case. So that, and some of this is obviously in the Obama administration current policy, but essentially build up national manufacturing laboratories. One of the interesting parts of the story here is that we know that the Obama administration put a lot of money into those advanced battery factories. It's less well known that they funded, as part of Oak Ridge Laboratory, a specific facility to help with advanced battery manufacturing. They had to invent, an ad hoc solution to help this new industry figure out how to solve the questions of moving up to the scale of mass production. And so what I'm arguing for is don't do that on a case-by-case basis, essentially build up the capacity, again, using the federal lab framework, using smaller laboratories funded at the university level. And so I think I'll just end with this point. I mean, I'd like to throw the Solyndra case back in people's face, because if you remember, the thing that Solyndra was trying to do was that they were making these solar panels which were cylindrical in shape so that they could follow the sun and draw more energy from the sun, but that Solyndra faced big problems in how the hell to make these cylindrical solar panels. And what I'm saying is that just as the federal infrastructure, the federal labs, helps with earlier stages of the innovation process, there's absolutely no rational reason that we shouldn't be helping firms move to that last stage of mass production. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Stephen Ezell. I'm a senior analyst with the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. For those of you who don't know us, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan technology and economic policy think tank in Washington, D.C., and our mission is to advocate for public policies that drive innovation and productivity-based economic growth in the U.S. and around the world. So I want to start with just what we see as three core principles for U.S. manufacturing renewal. And the first is that Enrico hit it directly on the head, that manufacturing matters because it's the key traded sector in our economy. And you can't have a vibrant national economy without a competitive traded sector. And that the real core problems our economy has faced over the past decade really stem from the inability of the U.S. to fill globally traded, competitive globally traded sectors. At the end of the day, if Trader Joe's beats out Whole Food in the grocery store industry in the U.S., we're still going to have the same number of grocery store jobs. But if Boeing loses to Airbus or Cisco loses to Huawei in international competition, we're going to lose those jobs in the U.S. They're going to get displaced to foreign countries. And since, as Enrico said, non-traded jobs are driven and supported by the underlying traded sector, we see that as what's really behind the jobs problem the U.S. has faced in the past decade. We also need to recognize that the U.S. for decades has been very strong at science-based innovation, but that's not enough. Science is a public good that's freely tradable around the world, and other countries have tended to take our scientific discoveries and commercialize them on an engineering basis into new products. We need to focus as much on engineering-based innovation as science-based innovation. And I would like to briefly throw my hat into the ring from the discussion this morning and make the point that policymakers have to recognize that U.S. manufacturing has been very unhealthy over the past decade and could be performing much better. So this shows job losses in manufacturing over the past 3 decades. In the 1980s, we lost 7% of our manufacturing jobs. In the 1990s, just 2.4%. But something fundamentally different happened in the 2000s when we lost 1/3 of our manufacturing workforce, 5.6 million manufacturing jobs, and that's a rate of job loss that was worse even than during the Great Depression. So something fundamentally different happened in the 2000s. So what is that? Well, you talk to a mini neoclassical economist, and I was on a panel recently with Bill Strauss, who is with the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank, and he says that U.S. manufacturing has never been healthier. It's quite a statement. Why does he say that? Well, he says that because U.S. manufacturing productivity has been quite strong over the past 2 decades. But what you find when you look at the past 2 decades is pretty much the same rate of manufacturing productivity growth in the United States. 53% manufacturing productivity growth in the 90s, 66% in the 2000s. But you had this massive disparity in job loss. So it's not productivity or automation that accounts for this. It's got to be something else. And we argue that fundamentally that something else is declines in output. When you look at the 19 highest level manufacturing categories, the North American Industrial Classification System, the NAICS codes, and you look at raw absolute output in the 2000s, 13 of 19 US manufacturing industries were producing less absolute output at the end of the decade than they were at the beginning of the decade. And in fact, as Susan talked about earlier, there was really this one sector, computer and electronic products, which was responsible for, which experienced 470% output growth, and which essentially accounted for 120% of the aggregate output growth. And as I think Susan said, when you look at some of the hedonic pricing factors, the import pricing factors, that's just very overstated. So the question is, what accounts for these declines pretty much across the board in manufacturing output and thus manufacturing jobs? And I think we agree with a lot of what Rob Scott had to say, that a lot of this is reflective of trade, of countries not competing fairly, cheating because of manipulating their currency, or because of other mercantilist practices, like saying to our companies, you can't sell in our markets unless you produce your things here, or you have to give us your IP or your technology to be able to sell here. A lot of it is countries cheating. But we think a lot of it also is that countries have gotten much more competitive. Over the past decade alone, 48 countries have introduced national innovation and technology policies to help grow the technology base of their economies to promote innovation. So it's a combination, yes, of other countries cheating, also of other countries being hungry for the things and the industries we have in the United States and competing harder. And it's the reality that was talked about. Multinational corporations can freely make location decisions now, and they go to the environments that offer the most attractive immigration, education, tax, trade policies, et cetera. So in the year 2000, US MNCs invested 33 cents abroad for every dollar they invested in the United States. By the end of the decade, they invested 71 cents abroad for every dollar in the United States. So they were finding better opportunities, better attractive opportunities to invest abroad. So for all these reasons, we think that's really what's behind the problems in the manufacturing economy. And when you measure it properly, real manufacturing value added was down 11% over the past decade. But it's not just loss of output and loss of jobs. When you look at the composition of our manufacturing economy, what you can do is assess it by the technological intensity of manufacturing industries. And this is data from the OECD STAN database that classifies countries' manufacturing sectors as either low technology, medium to low technology, medium to high or high technology. And what you find is that just about 20% of our manufacturing sector is in this medium to high space. But 50% of Germany's is, 58% of Germany's is, and also higher shares in Japan and Korea, right? So this really reflects the strength of Germany's middle stand, its small to medium-sized enterprises, which what they've been able to do is move up the value chain and capture very high levels of market share in the global markets in which they compete. And that chart right there is the reason why Germany pays their manufacturing workers 40% more per labor hour than we do in the United States. And if you roll the tape back to 1997, Germany has just lost 7.5% of its manufacturing jobs, while we've lost 47.5%. Germany is doing something different than we are, and we argue that we can learn from it. Of course, as was just said by Fred, we're also failing to commercialize technologies we invent, flat panels, robotics, solar cells, semiconductor memory devices. And kind of what that shows you is, we essentially have these high-tech sectors. We're about average compared to our major competitors. I mean, this is the very high-end ICT, nano, photonics, optics, but we're about average. And the reason why is because we haven't been commercializing the technologies we have created in the United States. So, and that matters, right? Because innovation is fundamentally about being the first to acquire new knowledge, being the first to apply it, and being the first to introduce new products and services into the marketplace. So that begs the question, what can we do to encourage manufacturing innovation in the United States? And we argue that we need to throw our manufacturers a raft, if you will, And these are better policies that support regulatory reform, better analytics, better finance policies. But at the core of it, we need to focus on what we call the 4 T's, better policies around technology, tax, trade, and talent to support our manufacturers, as we lay out in a report called A National Traded Sector Competitiveness Strategy. The first thing we need to do is invest more, both in federal R&D and then in manufacturing R&D specifically. So you think about it, the federal R&D portfolio is nowhere near optimized for economic growth. 81% of federal R&D goes to, quote, mission-oriented activities, and by this we essentially mean supporting the warfighter or on healthcare. Academic R&D in the physical sciences and the engineering sciences has been absolutely flat, and 75% of the R&D that does get allocated to manufacturing goes to just 2 industries, aerospace and instruments. So the R&D portfolio is not broadly focused to supporting commercial and manufacturing R&D in the United States. Now that picture is totally different in countries like Korea, Sweden, and Finland, where 95% of their federal R&D is allocated directly to supporting commercial or industrial R&D, essentially. So their portfolios are allocated directly to supporting economic growth, not to defense. The other problem is that we're underinvesting in R&D. If today our federal government invested as much as a share of GDP into R&D as it did in 1983, we'd invest $60 billion more a year in federal R&D. That's a real problem, and we're really underinvesting in applied and translational research. And I think this is what Germany especially does so well. And what we really lack is kind of an institutional framework to support pre-competitive, industry-relevant applied research and R&D. That's exactly what Germany has with its network of 60 Fraunhofer centers, or Fraunhofer institutes. And these institutes are designed directly to close the gap between research, between discovery and invention, and to commercializing that into new products in the marketplace. When you think about it institutionally, Germany has the Max Planck system, which is 100% publicly funded to do fundamental research. This is just like our National Science Foundation. But they have these Fraunhofer institutes that are essentially public-private partnerships co-funded by government, by industry, and by universities. And they solve this applied research and development problem. And we think that's been a real reason for the competitiveness of Germany's manufacturing economy over the past several decades. It's been instrumental in kind of infusing cutting-edge technologies into what once might have been thought of as legacy industries like ceramics or textiles. They help their SMEs, their Mittelstand firms, keep on the technological cutting edge. So I think, how am I doing on time, by the way? You're fine. I'm fine? Okay, very well. So in looking to address this gap in the manufacturing innovation ecosystem in the United States, the Obama administration has proposed to create a national network of manufacturing institutes. These would be 20 to 25 institutes to bring together cutting-edge research in an industrially relevant way across key sectors and manufacturing process technologies. The mission of these institutes would be to enhance U.S. industrial competitiveness by supporting the development of technologies enabling U.S. production facilities to gain global market share. And the proposals for these manufacturing institutes would be brought forward by industry, supported at least 50% by industry, and then matched by federal and state grants. From our point of view in Washington, this is actually the biggest, boldest initiative to support American manufacturing that we've seen since the 1989 Omnibus Competitiveness Trade Act. We think this could really be a fundamental game changer for the U.S. manufacturing economy. So what would these national networks of manufacturing innovation do? Well, they would provide a platform for pre-competitive applied research. They'd serve as hubs of manufacturing excellence in key product and process technologies. Much like Cimatech did for the US semiconductor industry in the 1980s, they would have developed technology and industry-specific roadmaps to identify technical hurdles to the growth of the industry and collaboratively work to overcome them. They would provide shared facilities for rapid prototyping and demonstration, shared validation and testing equipment. They would support education and training of production engineers, of PhD students. They develop training curriculum, they develop technical standards, and these would be fundamental to helping restore the US industrial commons, we believe, in key manufacturing process and product technologies. David Dornfield mentioned earlier the list of advanced technologies that we could look at these in, so I won't repeat that. I will add briefly that my colleague Rob Atkinson and a guy named David Hart, who ran the Advanced Manufacturing Program Office for the Office of Science and Technology Policy, are right now writing a paper on why America needs a national network of manufacturing institutes. I'd encourage you all to share any point of view, feedback you have there. But other competitors around the world are already taking action to support the industrial competitiveness of their industries. This would be key for us. I want to mention a couple of other technology policies that could help us, and one tax one, and then close. We think another thing we could do is to designate 25 US manufacturing universities, and these would essentially be tasked with revamping their university engineering programs to focus on manufacturing engineering and work that is much more collaborative with industry. If they were to do so, they would receive an annual award of $25 million from the NSF and priority on their applications for NSF grants. We also need to increase funding for MEP. When you look at how our competitors fund MEP as a share of their economy, Japan supports theirs 30 times more, Germany 20 times more, and Canada 10 times more. And even when you look at US historical levels, when we created the MEP in 1989, we funded it at essentially 28% greater than we do today as a share of our economy. But these have been really instrumental around the world. We did a study for the MEP benchmarking these types of programs, and what you find is that the return to for every dollar invested, the MEP in the US produces $30 of economic growth by supporting SMEs. That number is similar in Canada, it's similar in Britain. So these are really critical programs in closing the productivity gap that exists between small and large manufacturers around the world. And I'll just add, they have this great new program at MEP called the Innovation Engineering Management System, IEMS, but it's directly helping small manufacturers with new kind of innovation and new product development discovery methodologies. So MEP has moved from just focusing on the bottom line of better quality, of better processes, to now helping SMEs on the top line with identifying innovation and new growth opportunities. Just on tax policies, this is one of the biggest problems we think American manufacturers face. We now have the highest corporate tax rate of any OECD nation, and that's true not just on the statutory side, but also the effective side. We did a study, and we found that essentially American manufacturers pay a corporate tax rate higher by 37% than what Asian manufacturers pay on average, so we got to lower the corporate tax rate. And we also got to return to having a more competitive R&D tax credit. We invented this instrument in 1981. Up until 1992, we had the most generous R&D tax credit in the world. We're now just 27th in the OECD, and Brazil, China, and India offer more generous R&D tax credits to their manufacturers than we do to ours. So we think we need to create this American Innovation and Investment Tax Credit that provides an expanded credit for firms' investments in plant and machinery, in R&D, and in workforce training. We mentioned workforce training because US MNCs expenditures on workforce training have declined by 50% over the past decade as a share of GDP. And I just want to conclude by saying that smart policies really matter to the competitiveness of a nation. So Germany put in place this high-tech strategy for Germany in 2006, and they identified kind of 20 key industrial technologies that they wanted to support the competitiveness of Germany's economy in. Things like life sciences, nanotech, biotech, microelectrical mechanical systems, all the high-end stuff, all the stuff that we want. And what they did is they sat down this strategy, and they went through each of these 20 industries, and they said, where does Germany have strengths? Where do we have weaknesses? Where do we have threats? And where do we have opportunities? And they sat down and essentially built a roadmap for how Germany's industries could compete in these key technology spaces. And the result of that was that just 3 years later, by 2009, one study found that 30% of all German companies attributed their innovations over the past 3 years to, quote, improved research and innovation policies at the federal level. This is within our reach to do in the United States to put in place technology and innovation policies that support the competitiveness of our manufacturing firms. That's innovation policy, it's not industrial policy.
We're going to handle our Q&A as a hybrid of the first two panels. So what we're going to do is have just a few questions, 2 or 3, we'll say 3, and then we'll have the panelists respond to them so that we can integrate them somewhat. Where are the mics? We have some hands, but we need mics. Okay, let's have the hands up again. There's at least 3. Too bad we only have 2 mics. And young man there, and you're next.
This was, I think, an enormously good panel. Right? But let me comment on some of the things Steve was talking about, because I think they touch on very important points. There's a tendency in the US to think of innovation in connection with new products. New products usually small, right? Take a long time to grow into anything. But Steve was very clear that he was talking about existing products, improving them, learning to manufacture them. If you can do that in a major industry, you can retain that in your country, or you can retain your share of the world market. And that's a tremendous amount. It'll take a huge heap of little ones to make up for that. And so very often that's considered too dull for academia. And I think the emphasis on trying to get academics into that is really a very good one. And in addition, let me say something about those big industries. Many of them get dismissed as commodities. Semiconductor memory got that label, right? Why did it get that label? Because you could make it. Many people learned to make it, right? What happened when things become a commodity? The profit is low, becomes unattractive for a profit-oriented firm. That does not mean that being in that commodity would not be very good for the country with all the jobs, high value add per person engaged, and all of that stuff, okay? So sometimes our sole focus on profit takes us right out of some of the world's most important industries which we could remain in.
Yes.
So
Oh, no, we're going to have 3 questions, and then we're going to have everyone respond. Thanks. Sorry.
my name is Carl Nadler. I'm an economics student. So towards the end of the panel, we've kind of veered more into innovation. And if I've understood what we spoke about earlier in this day, is that all this productivity enhancements that we've seen in the manufacturing sector hasn't been particularly good for the quality of the jobs for the lower educated workforce in that sector. So it's not really clear to me that if the reason why manufacturing is stagnating in the US is for lack of innovation, it's not clear to me that if we really care about jobs and like what people are making, especially those who are less educated, it's not clear to me that we want to focus on R&D. So I want to kind of pivot back to what Suzanne Berger and what Fred Block were talking about with this story about, it kind of seemed to me like a reason why small businesses don't grow is kind of like a fish in a what's it called? Fish in a yeah, it's like the size of the fish will grow. Yeah, well, yeah. So the fish grows to the extent of the size of the space it's in, and so we kind of need these networks to support them. And I was wondering if these networks need to kind of support kind of longer term issues like this research and development, or these kind of short term needs. Because if it's short term needs, then if it's not really research and development, it seems like maybe we can do something for these manufacturing industries that might actually help the jobs we really care about. Thank you.
Okay, those two questions went together well. Let's let them respond, and then we'll come back to you, Bernhard, and you.
Yeah.
The young man in the jersey. But let's let our panelists respond first, because both those questions were somewhat broad and went together, and then we'll come to you. Thank you. Okay, who wants to start?
Well, I guess Ralph Gomery's point was about commodity production. And I would just say that in the interviews that we have done with large companies in this pie research, that we have found big companies making things like razor blades. This is Gillette, Procter and Gamble. So Gillette with razor blades, they're still made in Boston because the technologies, the equipment, they make all their own equipment. The place is like a fortress. You can't get in because both the tacit knowledge and the actual technology embodied in their equipment, they regard as highly valuable. And the people who make this stuff, so this is, on one hand, a commodity business, but one that's extremely profitable. Procter & Gamble diapers. It turns out NASA has gone to watch Procter & Gamble make diapers, which turn out to be a very complex thing to make cheaply, rapidly, and that also is a source of value. So I guess I don't know that I would follow Ralph Gomery in sort of wondering what kind of national policy there might be to support commodity businesses that are unprofitable, but I think there's still kind of a large scope for commodity production by the introduction of technology that can make things that look very ordinary, like diapers and razor blades. I think someone also today mentioned the production of things that are very bulky, so and therefore aren't likely to be transported. One of the companies I visited that was kind of interesting was making plastic milk jugs, things that looked like jugs for maple syrup, milk jugs. This company hired 170 people in Western Massachusetts, and their starting wages were $16 an hour, which is really pretty high. And the thing looked pretty simple. I said, why aren't these coming from China? The man said to me, look at them. Can you imagine what shipping a container full of air would cost? Things that are bulky are likely to be made locally. And so I think there's scope in these commodity businesses, even in ordinary things, for improvement, for production in the United States, and for the production of good jobs. This is not an area that we need to regard as a dead one.
Yeah, so, I'm arguing for expanding MEP for some of the same things that Stephen talked about, but not because I think that the manufacturing sector is going to absorb a lot of surplus labor. I think it's more a question of that we want to strengthen the innovation economy. A part of that innovation economy is the ability to do advanced manufacturing. That's part of a necessary infrastructure to do the kind of redistribution that Dick Walker was talking about, that we essentially have to do a lot of different things. We know now that the big corporations are not going to, whether it's manufacturing services or whatever, they're not going to create large amounts of employment. So I think what we're need to be thinking about are baskets of policies which make possible employment creation at the local level, at the regional level. A part of that is building these innovation clusters, advanced manufacturing clusters, but part of it is facilitating employee co-ops, small business, a range of different things to expand employment opportunities and expand quality employment opportunities.
I'll just add to your point about the short-sightedness of CEOs who constantly seek profit. We mentioned in our book a study from the Business Roundtable that surveyed 500 the CEOs of the top 500 companies in the U.S. 82% of them said that they would cut R&D in the current quarter to be able to meet their quarterly earnings. So there's no commitment to investing in innovation in the corporate world.
Okay, so let's go back to Gerhard Bosch.
Thank you. I have two comments. First, there was made the differentiation between high-tech, medium-tech, and low-tech industries. We should think about the relations between these industries. Very often, the medium-tech industries are technology appliers. They take some of the technologies, they embody them in their products which were developed in the high-tech industries. And it is surprisingly that in many countries with high wages, like in Germany, we still have high shares of low-tech industries. And these are, in fact, not low-tech. They are technology adapters. They use the technology developed in other areas. And so by definition, by the OECD, these are the industries which invest less than 2.5% in R&D. And some of them use modern technology and produce simple parts, but they can produce them in high wage countries because of a very high product innovation. The conclusion of this, from my point of view, is that diffusion of knowledge across and of new technologies across different sectors is crucial, and it would be very dangerous just to focus on high-tech industries. My second point, you mentioned the German high-tech strategy. It was heavily criticized in Germany, because it was said this is concentrating only on one part of the innovation process. And this is very dangerous for Germany because our strength is in other areas. And so we cannot just invest in R&D, but we have to look at the diffusion. And it was completely neglected in the first round of this high-tech strategy. What this meant for the technology adapters in other areas, and it was completely neglected the question of skills of workers. It was very much concentrated on engineers, and I discovered this a little bit in your presentation that probably this would be included in the question of training, etc. But you mentioned only engineers, and I think that's not enough. And also the infrastructure is important. And now in the second round of this high-tech strategy, for example, in manufacturing, there was a network created and unions were included and people from different technology adapter industries. And so I think the strategy is become broader and more concentrated on diffusion of technologies across the economy. And I think this is a real progress. The first round of the German high-tech strategy was really a top-down approach, which would not work at all.
Yes.
So we've been talking a lot about, I guess, manufacturing in this kind of abstract sense, but I'm interested in the stuff that's used in manufacturing to make the things, specifically around petroleum. There were two graphs put up earlier by Stephen. One had the growth of computers over the last decade was an anomaly, but if you look at the second highest one, it was petroleum products and coal products. And what we're seeing in this country is a renaissance of petroleum production. And in the industries that I study, if you were to ask people, is there going to be an industrial renaissance in the United States, they would, of course, say yes. Granted, most of them make petrochemicals for a living. We don't like to talk about petrochemicals in terms of innovation, because for the most part, they're really boring, right? Most of the design happened in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. A lot hasn't changed about them. But on the other hand, you also have highly innovative petrochemicals like the 787, right? Most of that plane is more petrochemical than any plane made before it. So I guess my question is, well, even touching on what Richard Freeman said, if 3D manufacturing comes to the United States, it's not going to be based on steel and iron. It's going to be based on resins and plastics. So what role is the petrochemical or petroleum renaissance, and therefore the petrochemical renaissance in the United States, going to have on manufacturing and jobs in the future?
Okay, there was one more hand. Yes.
This is Rob Scott from EPI again. I just want to add some more force to the argument for this, for building up these kinds of supporting institutions for manufacturing and diffusion of innovations. I think we have to keep in mind the United States has suffered scarring in the industrial sector as a result of the tremendous growth of trade deficits over the past 10 or 15 years. And so it's going to take an investment in building capacity and developing both new innovations as well as diffusing technology across existing products in order to reverse the hysteresis that's really, I think, now enveloped the U.S. Manufacturing sector. So I would add to that, I think there have been some mentions also of the need to work on the finance. I'd like to hear more about that. One of my pet ideas has been to develop a sort of a manufacturing finance institute, which would sort of a Manny May, if you will, which would parallel what the housing finance agencies do for the manufacturing sector.
That's a great show.
Yeah, nice. Thank you.
Good branding choice.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to let the panelists respond.
I mean, the person who raised the question of whether shale discoveries and fracking are really going to provide an industrial renaissance. I mean, I think there are huge, very extravagant claims made on this front, and I mean, of course, lower energy costs would be good for manufacturing, and it would be good for some sectors in manufacturing, presumably plastics and things that have closer and that have high energy use. But I think there we face a huge issue of whether we continue to have open borders and we actually start exporting some of this natural gas. And there's tremendous conflict within American industry over whether there should be easy authorization of export of this resource. There's been a kind of subtext through much of the discussions today about whether, in fact, we need seriously to change our trading arrangements with the rest of the world. And I guess I think that even identifying the role that currency manipulation plays and subsidies play, that by and large the United States has gained from living in a world with more open borders. And I personally, find it hard to imagine that we would really wish to live in a world in which the chance for developing countries, that they somehow were stuck at some levels of development where all they could ever hope to make would be footwear and clothing. So I certainly have little hope that we're going to develop international institutions that are going to somehow allocate shares of global production to any of us. So how we in the United States can both retain more or less the kind of free trading arrangements that I think have been a source of strength for this economy, at the same time that we, in fact, regrow and renew American manufacturing. This is what I think is really the challenge. But I think that there are very different views on the question of exactly how open the border should be, and that with respect to the shale question and to the export of natural gas, we're about to see major battles in Washington on this.
Well, I'm going to just kind of make some comments. I think that I've been around this kind of discussion long enough to just kind of have a little kind of warning flag go on in terms of, we've heard a lot about Germany and the German model today, and Germany's doing very well. But back in, when I began this, there was Japan, and then we had Ireland, whoops, and Spain, whoops. So, I wish Germany well. But in 2 or 3 years, we might. So, and I think that this is important for some of the kind of just the marketing of what you're doing. I think I support it 100%. But I think that the U.S. would benefit in the long run from a U.S. way. And I think all of the things that we've talked about in terms of clusters, in terms of network development, that stickiness around small firms is the way to go. And that leads to my second point. Is that there's a debate here between whether we've had scarring in the manufacturing sector or if it's never been better, which sounds like anyway. I've heard the same thing from people who are not doing very well in their personal life. Never been better, So there's a little bit of denial there, but I think that underneath that, in an academic setting, you can have a debate like that. Here, the debate has kind of been there, whether there's even a problem at all or not. But if you can't get past that beginning of that discussion, it's hard to get to solutions. Now, what the subtext is the kind of data that I showed. Big firms are deeply globally engaged, and small firms aren't. So we've heard we haven't really addressed this directly. But beneath a lot of what we're talking about is small firms have a really hard time getting financing. They getting across the valley of death, et cetera, and they need this kind of manufacturing extension center. Big firms don't, and they also have very strong kind of lobbying in Washington. So if you come down to the kind of and you read the reports or the kind of the statements from the American Association of Manufacturers, here's where you're going to read that it's not a problem, okay? Because because these are companies that are operating on a global scale and they don't want kind of anything stepping in their way. So let's just kind of bring that out into the fore. Now, when I looked at the materials that were being marketed by the small firm associations, it was kind of loony left stuff. It was very kind of we have to fight against big cap. It was not this pragmatic sense. So I don't see a reasonable voice in Washington because a lot of this kind of policy is politically driven. The reason that we have voluntary export restraints in the auto industry that's pushed all of this production to the United States by Japanese and Korean, et cetera, firms is because there was a constituency there. Because when we had import penetration around automobiles in the 70s, there was a huge uproar and there was a pushback. When that happened in electronics, because it's not a unionized sector, there wasn't a peep, okay? So you see today the legacy of that. Now, I don't see the constituency for small firms. The people and the companies that are going to use these manufacturing and benefit the most from these manufacturing extension centers. And I don't really see a way forward, but I think that's probably the most important thing to do, as opposed to designing the policies that are going to be kind of blocked at every turn by big companies.
Let me ask my own question that I've been trying to ask. Just because I think the panel before on manufacturing services and job creation basically said, you know what, when you look at our whole sort of economy, you really can't just focus on manufacturing and get your job creation there. At least I thought that was sort of the overall message. And then we moved to this panel on innovation, where if you went and took a world survey, people would say the U.S. is the most innovative country, and every country I ever go to, they're just green with envy about the U.S. ITC electronics sector. They're just dying to replicate the Silicon Valley and Austin and Boston, and so I find it fascinating that when we have this panel, basically it's gloom and doom, even though the U.S. It's almost like I want to say, what did we learn from our ITC sector, or what did we learn from where the ecosystems did work in the U.S. to make us innovative in one industry? So I did hear something really important. Industry matters. And so everybody says, wow, we did great in ITC. We're still the world leader by far. And so Is it because every other industry has a different pattern or a different process, and that ITC is like isolated way out here, and therefore the U.S., because that's where we're the leader, we're now isolated in terms of, oh, gee, we can't do anything else. Is that what I'm hearing you tell us today? And that therefore we have to come up with whole new policies that might even undermine ITC, as long as we can bring back all the other sectors, or bring back at least some of the other sectors. That's what I want to hear. I did hear that ITC is different.
Are you asking why did we do well in that sector and not in the others, and what can we learn from
I'm
that?
asking from all the policies I've heard, everything, like, is there anything, Suzanne, that we learned from ITC and our international leadership in it that we could apply to other sectors and other industries in the U.S., or is it just ITC is so different that unfortunately we got somehow that made us unable to see other industries well?
Information and telecommunications.
Oh, IT, and yeah, information technology and communication. It includes semiconductors,
Well,
electronics.
this would
and
be
so forth.
a sector that, if we think about the change in corporate structure that's taken place in the United States from the 1980s to today, a change from a world that was dominated by large, vertically integrated companies to a world in which you now have networks of smaller firms and startups. What we learned was that those firms that are able rapidly to move innovation out of the new centers of technology creation in universities and public laboratories, because that's where innovation is coming from, that those firms that are able to start up and to go public relatively rapidly are the firms that really do well in this new environment. And this is an environment that has many strengths because it allows many more innovators to really create companies. Not only innovators in the United States, but innovators in other countries as well. So it's a world in which you don't have to come to life with everything that a Sony or a Hitachi or even a Samsung had in its startup days. You can start as a relatively small player and find resources that in suppliers around the world. So that, I think, is the big lesson that we have from information technology, and that's where we did really well. The United States in that sector adjusted remarkably well to the new conditions of scaling up innovation. Unfortunately, I don't think that lesson is one that's very applicable for many of the new emerging industries. That's the dilemma.
Or another way of putting it is that we developed in Silicon Valley, again with a very substantial role of the federal government, a regional ecology which was very dense with very strong networks, and that was the basis on which venture capital could develop, but that in most of the rest of the economy we don't have that infrastructure. Venture capital doesn't exist in the same way. And that's what we're talking about, having to build from the bottom up some greater organizational ecology that would make it more likely that more of these firms would be able to succeed.
Right. So let's go back to the floor to Ashok and this young woman over there. And this will be our last round of questions. Ashok Bardhan. I think you can go.
So what's so special about ICT? You said, but haven't social scientists speculated for a while that the ICT sector succeeded in the US because it's so compatible with the social and cultural dynamism of the United States? Anyway, that was not my question. So my question for the panel generally is, what do you think about if innovation is the kind of panacea for all ills, in a sense, what do you think about the more recent work of Robert Gordon and Tyler Cowen and all, who talk about innovation in the US is going to face serious headwinds in the near future because of a number of things, the educational issue, the debt, inequality, demographics, a number of issues are brought up. And Tyler Cohn, who says that basically we happen to be, for various technological and other reasons, at some point in the stage where innovation has plateaued, or so the economic appropriability of innovations, at least at a nation-state level, not at the firm level. Firms can move, nation-states cannot. So that is in jeopardy. I mean, I'm just throwing this out. Not that I believe in it personally, but since a lot of publicity was generated by these claims, and this is an innovation panel, so I thought I'd bring it up.
Okay. This is Thea Lee with the AFL-CIO, and I wanted to pick up on Suzanne's point about globalization, and maybe, it's a little late in the evening, and maybe we'll pick this up in the final evening session, but I feel like people, of all the really interesting presentations that we've had today and all the discussion, I feel like the discussion on globalization has been a little bit shallow, that it's not so much a question of whether we're going to be in a global economy or not be in a global economy, because those aren't, it isn't a bipolar question here. It's more about how we shape the rules of globalization in ways that support good jobs at home, and how we can do that in the context of supporting workers' rights and environmental standards in other parts of the world. And so I think it's not a throwaway question whether other countries are more successful than the U.S. because they're cheating, in terms of currency or subsidies or violations of workers' rights or consumer standards or environmental standards, versus whether they're succeeding because they're being, as Stephen said, more competitive, and they're actually investing in infrastructure and in skills and in education and so on. Those are two very, very different paths, and the kinds of policies that we need to think about in the United States are very different. And when we think about our trade policy, and I think that's one of the ways where our government has failed, is that we haven't integrated the way we think about our trade policy, our tax policy, our infrastructure policy as an industrial policy. So I just wanted to put that out there, because I think it's doing a disservice to say that, of course we're going to be in a global economy. Of course we want developing countries to have opportunities and to be in other sectors, and we know they will be, whatever we do. But we need a set of rules that is more focused on supporting both innovation and good jobs in the United States, and we don't have that.
Okay, so obviously some of that will come back after dinner, but let's have our panelists respond to the comments very briefly.
Well, I was going to say before that the presentation was that the traded sector is 30%, assuming that we can move towards energy self-sufficiency with green technologies particularly. There's a lot of reason to believe that over 20 years that traded sector is going to shrink to 15%. So that starts to suggest that we've got a tail wagging the dog problem here. In other words, that if we're talking about developed economies where 85% of production is not in the traded sector, why are we in such a tizzy about globalization? And it suggests a different way of thinking about the world economy. I mean, that we're locked in this neo-mercantilist world where we're fighting over each industrial advantage and so forth. And at a certain level, at a Keynesian level, we know, I mean, Bosch said that this morning, it doesn't make sense. Not every country can run a trade surplus. So we need to be thinking about reform of the global rules of the game at the same time that we start thinking about trade policy in a different kind of way. So, I think that's a part of the story.
Suzanne?
I guess I disagree a little with Fred, because I think the point that Enrico Moretti, I don't know if he's still here, was trying to make is that the flourishing of the traded goods and services sector is what is pulling up wages in the untraded sector. That if we look, I mean, and what he shows in his book on this subject is that if you look at the wages of even unskilled workers, working in the Seattles and Cambridge Bostons and Austins of this country, that their wages are pulled up by the fact of working in environments and working in companies where wages that the whole system is pulled up by the traded goods and services. So I think that maintaining competitive strength in traded goods and services is absolutely vital to the wage levels. We can't kind of just accept. And why does that happen? It's because traded goods and services can be sold in very large markets around the world, whereas if you're a yoga instructor or a music teacher, or you're really going to be offering your services in a very small market. So exactly what the productivity gains are going to be are going to be constrained by the size of your market. So I guess I don't hope for the future you're hoping for.
Well, I'm not saying that we should ignore the traded sector and that we shouldn't try to compete in it, but I think there's something wrong about the causality. In other words, the elementary school teacher who turns the kids on to science is actually making a contribution to human capital, to the development of technological capacities. That's not coming from the traded goods sector. So there's a kind of reification in that division that denies the capacity of the society to develop human beings who have the opportunity, the capability of using technologies and so forth. So I really think that that's a problematic notion that all of the economic advance comes from the traded goods sector. I think it's an interdependent system, and we need both. I mean,
Let's give economic growth, not human, not the moral value of the teacher.
Okay, let's give Tim a chance to chime in because we're ending up this panel very soon.
Okay, just to complicate that a little bit further, I think one thing we learned with the services offshoring debate, that what's non-tradable today may be tradable tomorrow. So maybe not a yoga instructor, but I think that the industrial policies need to be kind of extremely flexible and agile to keep up with technological change and innovation that is not anticipated. So you have the codification of services work, but then you have companies like Oracle and SAP kind of hiring a lot of people to develop kind of ERP systems that kind of facilitate this. So it's a dynamic process, and I think that we're going to have massive online teaching. So it's coming to the university as well.
Well, we're going to get back to these topics after dinner. I really want to thank our panel for making a very stimulating comment, and thank the audience. You all were great.
Please stick around, have dinner. We'll come right back for our last panel.